Correct. So I'm a first generation college student, and I didn't go directly to college. I took a lot of really terrible jobs. Before I went to college, I was a short order cook. I dug sewers, literally dug sewers in Virginia, which is great preparation for being a journal editor. I was a drill operator in a factory in Detroit. I did a lot of really very unpleasant things, and I came to realize that I really don't like to work. And so college seemed like a pretty good dodge to avoid work for a while. And so I ended up at the University of Michigan and studied philosophy and psychology. And I'm coming to realize that philosophy, although philosophy majors are disappearing because law schools are disappearing, and that turned out to be mostly why people majored in philosophy, was to go to law school. But it's become really newly relevant in a lot of ways because of the organization of the economy. And I think that the thing that I've had the best good fortune with is I've had an amazing set of mentors and now an amazing set of students. So Rick Price, Jeff Pfeffer was my dissertation advisor, and he's incredibly brilliant. Bob Kahn, Mayor Zald, Dick Scott, Michael Cohen. Just throughout my career, I've had people that saw a lot more promise in me than I ever saw in myself, and they were really generous in helping me make good choices. And now what I'm realizing about being late middle-aged is that it's really, it's hard to have to make all your decisions yourself without good advisors. I'm hoping to find some new advisors. If anybody on the phone has advice for me, that would be helpful. And now I kind of got the next generation. I've had the really good fortune to have super brilliant students who are smarter and more accomplished than me, and I get to sort of ride on their coattails and try not to screw things up for them. And I just learn a lot from, we get amazing doctoral students at Michigan, like Lyndon, who's a genius. So we just have, it's a great thing to be surrounded by talented people who can
Absolutely.
keep moving. So that's it. Older and younger have been the things. Years are also pretty good, but so the reason why I ended up studying financialization as a topic and changing corporations was, a couple of offhand comments from Jeff Pfeffer. So if you ever spend time with him, you realize that he's like one of the smartest people you'll ever meet. He's a deeply insightful guy. And, just that on a whim, he said, there's a lot of hostile takeovers going on here in the 80s. And I think this is probably companies that are trying to screw over their employees and steal their pensions. Why don't you go find out if that's true? And that stray comment sort of sent me on a 20-year trajectory to try to understand how is finance shaped both the corporation, but also the broader American economy. And like one of the things that distinguishes, I think, everyone that I mentioned, and especially Jeff or Mayor Zald, had this amazing capacity to sort of see events in the world and ask, what is this a case of? So they don't just read, oh, interesting recount in Florida. They say, well, what does this recount in Florida have to say about the nature of democracy and technology and demographic shifts? And they had an ability to sort of to see what was going on in the world as an instance of something that we might be able to explain. And given that organizations are so central to so much of what happens in the world today, they would, Mayer had this ability to say, look at this. This completely exemplifies this important process. Or conversely, look at this. This should not happen. This is the opposite of what should happen. And so they could sort of see events as the starting point for this journey to figure out something bigger. And I just really admire that. But Mayer had this amazing turn of mind to be able to do that. And I think that's had that a long, in meeting him, 30-something years ago, just seeing him come in and say, I read something in the paper today, and here's what it means to me. I thought, what do I have to do to be like Mayer? Like, what would it take to be able to view the world with this lens that allows you to sort of conceptualize it as not just a bunch of stuff happening, but having some logic to it? And to me, that's a really nice turn of mind for a researcher, to be able to recognize not just, oh, Uber is cheap, but say, oh, Uber represents a shift in the nature of labor markets. It's going to change corporate capitalism. So that to me was probably the biggest thing.
So,
I was very fortunate to be in grad school where I was at the time in the 80s, because there were both a lot of smart faculty hanging around at that school at the time, but also we had the Center for Advanced Study where smart people would come in for a year at a time. And I managed to have lunch with these folks and be part of their seminars. So I don't know if there's an easy, you can recognize that turn of mind by talking to somebody, by having lunch with them and just see what they talk about. If they're sort of complaining about teaching, then maybe you're not going to learn a lot from them. If they're sort of talking about ideas, then this is someone to talk to. I guess a feature that I'd look for is it really helps to talk to people who have really different backgrounds or approaches from you. So some of my most valuable colleagues, especially when I was a junior faculty member, were people that did research completely unlike mine. And so it was like, people who were studying negotiation and decision making, which was, other end of the spectrum from what I did, but they were smart and they were reasonable and they knew what a good argument was. And I realized that if I could speak to them, if I could talk to Max Bazerman and make an argument and give evidence that he found persuasive, then I had won. So it wasn't that I was convinced that I was talking to the other cult members that did what I do. I was talking to someone who's just a really smart person with standards. And so smart people who care about ideas, but they're in computer science or they're sort of in a different field from you, walking them through the journey, if they can be generous enough to sort of step through your argument with you, you can learn a lot from them. Like smarts is just a generic thing, I think. And if you get smart people who are generous, then they don't really need to be your nearest neighbor intellectually or co-authors. They just need to be able to sort of play along with the gag. When I dug into the data in a paper I published before most of you were born, we looked at sort of hostile takeovers in the US, and the striking fact was that about 1/3 of the Fortune 500 disappeared in a 10-year period. So there 28% got takeover bids and a bunch of others voluntarily merged. That sounds, if you're not a strategy person, and I'm not a strategy person, like, yeah, boring, whatever. But that was a really major shift in the organization of the American economy. And it was just vast. It changed sort of the structure. Conglomerates disappeared. Companies bought into focus. They started outsourcing a lot more. The idea that corporations exist to create shareholder value went from a crazy thing that people at Rochester said to, the truth. And so it felt like that was a really big transition in the organization of the economy. And yet my own field didn't have a lot to say about it. And so I discovered when I was doing job talks that I'd have to do about a 15-minute tutorial on here's what voting rights are in corporations. Here's what a board of director does. Here's what a tender offer is. And I had to kind of teach myself this stuff about finance and accounting to be able to convey it. But it seemed really clear that some really major shift was happening in the organization of the economy. It was going to turn out to be very consequential. And so once I started down that path, thankfully, because of events in the world, it was just my research question I realized was, what the hell just happened? Because there were enough weird things going on in the world. Like, wait a minute, corporations used to make stuff and now they hire vendors to make stuff. Where did that come from? Wait a minute, it used to be good to be big. Now it's good to be small. How did that happen? Corporations used to have internal labor markets and promotion ladders that would allow people to join the middle class, and now they're lean and mean. And so there were sort of enough events going on in the world that what the hell just happened turned out to be a pretty good ongoing research question, because things kept changing. Where did that dot-com bubble come from, and why did it collapse? So there were enough sort of changes going on in the corporate world that I always had some new thing to try to make sense of. And if you're the person that can bring sort of theoretical tools and methods to it, then that's a big plus. I mean, if you're a journalist, you can say, look at this crazy thing that just happened, but we have the capacity to gather pretty systematic information to unpack it. So, and I mean, the reason it was important was that I had grown up, at least in the little bubble of organization theory where I've resided. We believe that organizations are everything, that we live in a society of organizations, and from the hospital you're born in to the franchise funeral parlor that drops you into the ground. We live in this society of organizations that shape everything. And if that shape is radically changing, we need to figure out why. So I dug a lot more into finance and started to see how financial markets had started to shape all kinds of social reality. Like we use phrases like human capital and social capital, not as horrifying, corrosive metaphors that undermine society, but as kind of the obvious way to talk about things. Oh, you're going to college to invest in your human capital. Well, that's a terrible way to talk about college. I mean,
Yeah, it is.
that's like, I thought we were in the education business. Turns out that we're basically a factory for human capital. And so to me, that was sort of the drive, the shift in the nature of the corporation and the sort of increasing centrality of finance. It seemed like they didn't just stop in 1990. When I finished my dissertation or published a couple of papers, they kept on going in ever more Baroque ways. And now we're living through this sort of generation-long episode of Black Mirror. We're really in the US, we're really kind of in a pickle here because we have tied our social welfare system entirely to the corporation. I mean, so much of what we think of as the American dream is tied to large, long-lasting corporate employers. So, in the civilized world, you get health insurance or health care because you're a Canadian, or because you live in Denmark or France. In the US, you get health care if you work for an employer that provides health insurance. And maybe these days mostly they do, but that's, to a lot of people that would sound insane. If people change jobs every 6 months, why would it make sense for employers to be the way that people get health insurance? And similarly for retirement security. And moving into the middle class, a lot of people do that by graduating from college, getting a job at Eastman Kodak or Westinghouse, and working their way up. Well, they're gone and they're not coming back. And so if you take this central institution of the economy, the major corporation, and it kind of evaporates or it gets replaced by 9 of the 12 biggest employers in the US now are retailers, you are not going to move into the middle class working at the dollar store. So to me, it felt incumbent on me to say, both to make this case, to sort of make understandable, big corporations are disappearing, and it's not going to be as great as you think. It's because of the way that America's social welfare system is set up. This is going to be a disaster for access to healthcare, for economic mobility, for retirement preparedness. And so we really need to understand what has happened and where it's left us, and then what are the choices that this leaves us now. The case for a single payer health plan is not because you're a communist and want to live in Denmark. It's good for business too. I mean, the way that businesses operate these days, we kind of need a shift in public policy to enable people to make a secure life in this world when we no longer have large corporations to take care of us. And to me, that was kind of the big aha at the end of the day was people need to know about this. Policymakers need to know about this and to understand and have a better map of the way the economy works. I have this odd job title of Associate Dean for Business Plus Impact. And it was created by our current dean, Scott DeRue. He started about 2.5 years ago. And 1 year in, he said, impact should not just be this sidelight of what the school does. It should be a central feature of what this school, and I think every business school does, is to think about the social impact of our work. We're being funded by taxpayers and by students who fund our work. They have good reason to ask, what do your fund findings in Administrative Science Quarterly have to say about how I live my life? How can the work that you're doing that we're funding inform the way we organize the economy? And so this job of associate dean gave me an opportunity to help figure out, how do we translate the bench science that researchers do, the great work that we're, all the people on this call are doing, how do we translate that into insights for practice? And so that's what I'm trying to do through a variety of measures that I won't tell you about at the moment. But that's kind of the role, is to figure out what do we do to make the ecosystem favor research that, say, makes practice towards the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, to put one label on it. Like, how do we make it possible for people to get tenure? I think we focus so much on sort of the angst and the pressure around tenure, but we have a faculty member in my school who got tenure in 1970 and is still teaching here. So people, he's in his early 80s, I think, and he's still like doing his work and doing his research and contributing to the world. I mean, the vast arc of academics' careers are after tenure. And at that point, I don't feel that we should be, I mean, it feels weird to say, oh, I was on a hamster wheel for 6 years. Now I'm going to keep doing that for the rest of my life and do these bite-sized chunks of research. It's like, you could take a risk and you're probably not going to get fired unless you do something crazy. And so that just feels like a gift, that we can take a longer term perspective. I'm always surprised by my colleagues who are chaired full professors and they're worried about their annual evaluation. Any university that I've been in, if you win a Nobel Prize, you get a 3% raise. And if you did nothing for the year, you get a 2% raise. And then if you're somewhere in the middle, you get a 2.5% raise. Like, that can't be your good reason for doing the work that you do. And so why not think about, legacy and solving problems out there? You can't just change one school or one journal or one institution at a time.
That's right.
Like, we live in an ecosystem that has a configuration that reinforces a focus on journal articles and citation counts, and that those journals are the gatekeepers, and they're measured, their impact is measured by citations in the literature, not by impact on the world. And tenure committees look at those publications and those citations as the measure of impact. I mean, if you ask anyone outside academia, what do you think academic impact means? They're not going to mention Google Scholar. They're going to think pretty differently about impact. So all that being true, the standards for untenured people, I do not, sorry, Lyndon, I don't see a pathway in the world that we live in anytime soon, or certainly not before anybody on the call gets tenure, that's going to change those. We realize that if one school said, all right, instead of focusing on top journals and citations, we're going to focus on something else for tenure, then when they're recruiting junior faculty, when doctoral students come out and give talks, they'll say, tell me about your tenure standards. And if you say, well, here at Boston College, we're completely unique. We evaluate you on these 5 things unlike any other school because we want to make the world a better place. And any person that knows, any sane person is going to say, whoa, that seems like a big risk here. What if I go to work at this school and I don't meet their standards, then I can't get a job anywhere else? So if you don't have tenure, for better or worse, you really do need to kind of prove yourself in the crucible of journals and citations. Inside baseball, but if you've been tracking what happened in law schools, it is the apocalypse. They about 5 or 6 years ago, applications to law school started dropping off, and when it hit bottom, the enrollments in first year enrollments in law schools had dropped something like 40%. That is a really big number. So I think we have about 200 accredited law schools in the US. So we really have room for about 50. And that's the kind of thing, I think that the freestanding 2-year MBA program is facing very similar problems, that convincing 28-year-olds, quit your high-paying job, move your family to Hanover, New Hampshire for 2 years and give us $150,000. That is a troubled model. So I think that freestanding MBA programs, there's definitely, we are observing a bit of a sort of overcapacity and differentiation problem. where you might see a dozen or 20 top schools that offer something that's really unique. And then the other schools are either going to sort of not have an MBA program at all, or it'll be part-time, or it'll have 15 students none of whom pay tuition because they need to have some shop window that gets rated. And so like an awful lot of schools have an MBA program, mostly because they need to say they have an MBA program, but it's definitely a loss leader. But at the other end, for undergraduate programs, business is by far the most popular major in America, for better or worse. And I'd probably say worse. That's I was a philosophy major, so pre-unemployment. But there's going to be demand for business education in bulk. The problem is that it's not the high-paying customers who are anteing up $60,000 a year and can fund us to do, fund studies of the wine industry or whatever. That it's going to be large enrollment classes in bulk that might not allow people sort of the spare time to do kind of research that they want. And for public institutions, such as the one that I'm at, there's a limit to how much we're going to be allowed to raise tuition in the future. There's just, is known as the cost disease of the service sector. Tuition kept going up for years. I don't think that can continue the way things are. But faculty expect to get paid more every year. We keep thinking we get raises, even though we're still teaching the same classes at the same speed we always did. So we never really get any more productive. So all of this kind of suggests that there's a built-in pressure. And the concern is going to be that if state legislatures start showing up and saying, why are we funding you to do X, Y, Z? And we're starting to see that happen in a few places now. I think Wisconsin has been, sadly, one of the, I think, great academic institutions of the 20th century, and a slightly unenlightened, let's say, governor and legislature have not been as generous as they might be there. In Florida, the governor said, why are we funding anthropology? There are no jobs in Florida for anthropology majors. Let's stop funding that major. So we're already seeing around the edges both the pressure around tuition and pressures around what kind of majors do we want to have. And so it feels that during whatever the next economic downturn is, that you'll start seeing more funding entities saying, why aren't you using more temps? So to me, if I think any institution that's attentive to this is going to want to be able to say, hey, send your contingent of state legislators here, and we're going to show you what we're doing with the water supply in Flint, democratic workplaces. We're creating new apps that solve problems that the voters of your state care about. So you asked a simple question, and I gave a long answer, but I think the pressures are already here. I think the law school is a cautionary tale of what can happen. And so we need to prepare now to be able to have something to say for ourselves when, the governor of Florida stops by. Think about what is the time frame for this. Yeah. So if you say, we want to introduce total quality management and, we want to do an experiment, 5 companies get CQM and 5 companies get a placebo. Well, it's probably going to take 5 years for you to see whether this works or not. And so built into that is a very long time horizon. Meanwhile, your tenure clock's ticking away, unfortunately. But so I think that's right, that, one model is to maintain ongoing relationships with sort of the business community, like what Andy does in Minneapolis, St. Paul, is to just throw the doors open to the business community and say, we want to maintain ongoing ties with you. You can imagine having a built-in relationship manager so that, you've been working with 3M for the past 30 years and you have access to what the prior engagements have been. It takes a little bit of care to be able to do that. I'm going to make a slightly more psychedelic point here. This does not reflect the views of my co-authors. Full transparency, Bill Glick did the heavy lifting on the article in BizEd, so that's and so he's not responsible for what I'm about to say. I'm not sure that So I'm not sure that we should think of the executive vice president at IBM as our core constituency for the work that we do. And
Mm-hmm.
so sometimes if you say we need to have relevance for practice, people immediately think managers in existing major corporations that recruit our students.
Okay.
I would prefer to see the broader society as our constituency, um, including kids, my kids that I've left this terrible climate destroyed context
Yep.
for. Like I'm thinking about their future, and I don't think it's going to be working at IBM. I don't think that it's necessarily solving the problems of existing organizations. We're now at this turning point in the organization of capitalism where the institutions that we're going to see in the next century might not look anything like Westinghouse or Eastman Kodak or IBM. They might be worker-owned co-ops, or they might be, Pokemon Go. That sounds ridiculous, but Pokemon Go kind of is a model for coordinated collective action. Like you could imagine new forms of enterprise that look more like, the Women's March or Pokemon Go or Linux or something like that. So I think we should be institutionally agnostic, that if we think that business is a means and not an end in itself, then it's a tool for getting stuff done. Like business is kind of like a diesel truck. Well, that's one way of transporting things, but maybe you should have magnetic levitation railways or drones to do that. And so instead of being tied to existing, let's say existing recruiters as being the core constituency, maybe we should be thinking, now that we've got all of these tools, how do we create something different? So the model might be less like maybe medicine and more like architecture or engineering. Like, wow, we've now got glass that can be a millimeter thick and stronger than steel. What kind of structures can we make? We're kind of in that situation now. We could be creating new structures. And I don't think we value that as a form of research. Like, we don't think of it as research, coming up with a cool new organization design and an app to run the thing. Like, we think of that as it doesn't sound like the kind of thing that would end up in a journal, but that could be our greatest contribution, is thinking more like computer science, where writing a really good algorithm counts as research. So that's a little psychedelic, but I think that would be computer science or architecture might be a good model for us, where it's creating new structures rather than just making sense of the ones that are already out there. I think that the move to big data from CompuStat and even beyond is probably lamentable, but I don't see a path out of it as long as we have all of the reviewers that we currently have, because people, and not without reason, because you really can't make great inferences much of the time based on cross-sectional data. But the action research question, and I think behind John's question, because this is going to sound psychedelic as well, so as you know, it's one of my favorite words. We're living in a time now where so much of what happens in organizations is mediated online and happens through apps and through software. So every company today is using an enterprise resource planning system that knows when people check in, and they might be wearing a tag that tracks them all day at work and when they take their bathroom breaks. If you go into any retail store, Accenture has installed software to keep track of every employee and what their productivity is, and did they upsell that lady on the silk scarves we're trying to get rid of. So to the extent that organizations run on software as they do, this creates this really interesting opportunity that we could start to make organization design and job design more of an experimental science. So when we study job designs, from Adam Grant's dissertation, he went to a call center, and half the kids got a speech by someone who benefited from their work and the other half didn't, and that was the intervention. Cool, it's an understandable intervention, but today those guys would all be on web-based software where you could implement a Latin squared design for 2 weeks and then shift to someone else. This sounds psychedelic, but I had a doctoral student, Teddy DeWitt. You should all hire him. He's a genius. And he's working with a company that is an office cleaning company where the people that work there are using augmented reality goggles to go about their day. And so a very sort of standard, task has become this very high tech job, and it means that people at headquarters can say, all right, all of the people cleaning on floor 5 get the following job design. When they walk into the office, a little video gets triggered that said, hey, it's David here. I love the way you clean my office. Thank you so much. And you meet the beneficiary, just like Adam Grant did with his dissertation. And the people on floor 4, you don't get that. You get a picture of a frog or something. And so that sounds a little weird, but we could now be doing the kind of A/B testing that they do at Facebook or Google. So, Google will say, half the people get this headline, half get this headline. What do they click through? We can do that in organizations now. And so I think the prospects for experimental organization design and experimental job design, we're just getting into that world. And so I'd love to think, people that know more about action research, can we think about ways to use the current technology in organizations to implement experiments in real time? And I think this is very exciting for a macro person. We always have archival data on stuff that happened in the past, and then we make up stories about why the experimental condition worked the way that it did. But now you can very realistically implement the kind of A/B testing that happens in tech companies, but in the organizational world. So if you're thinking about a dissertation now, I think this is going to be a really interesting opportunity. Learn some computer science and find ways to collaborate on companies so that you can sort of do action-based research sort of in the wild, in a sense. There have been some scandals in the medical research literature. There was an article I read 2 days ago about a professor in Japan who had published literally dozens of articles with fake data, and those got entered into the meta-analyses, and they're now discovering that the meta-analyses that are advising people's treatments were based on fake data, and they're wrong. So that's kind of a horrifying prospect, that if they're really, it only takes one highly productive researcher to really screw up the findings of an entire field. And so that was good reason to start quaking, to think that we're assuming that the things that get published in the journals are actually right, and that the people are accurately reporting what they did, and that the numbers are true, and that they didn't just make it up. But as more papers get rescinded, there's reasons to be, I think, anxious about meta-analyses. I mean, that was just a horrifying thing to read, because it's medicine, and they actually care. We care what gets found in medicine. People don't care as much what we find. But the other side of that, at least in my end of the field, I only wish we had the problem of meta-analysis being able to aggregate, because in fact, what journals tend to prefer is novelty and counterintuitive findings. And it's really hard. By the definition of a counterintuitive finding, it means it doesn't accumulate. You're saying, this thing that we, like Murray Davis's article, this thing that we thought was true turns out not to be true. I found a counter case. It's almost like crabs trying to crawl out of a barrel. The way that you make your mark is to pull the crab back in. Any insights that start to get established, that thereby makes them something that you want to show isn't really true. And so I think cumulative knowledge is really tricky, to the extent that journals and reviewers value novelty over accumulation, and they value the counterintuitive rather than the work that builds on prior work. So it feels like just the built-in incentives for our field for novelty lead us into this kind of Winchester mystery house. There's a beautiful metaphor that you should look up in my last ASQ editorial, because it's really funny, but we don't have time to walk through it. Sort of a lot of rooms that don't add up to anything, essentially.